Hey, A-Pushers. So for this lesson, this is going to be kind of review of what we've learned about the civil rights movement thus far, things that you've learned in previous classes, as well as what we've learned earlier in this school year. We'll continue on with this same lecture a little bit later on, but this is just the background that you're going to need to start off with. So, like I said, we're going to be starting off with the origins of civil rights and kind of what comes first, second, third, etc. So I'm not going to cover the entire history of African Americans in the United States. We'll do that at another time. But to kind of look at civil rights and a movement for gaining greater equality for African Americans, we're going to go back to key period 4. And we're going to be talking about Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was a transcendentalist, and he had written a very important essay titled On Civil Disobedience. And this particular essay was describing his feelings that it was essential as an American to disobey unjust laws. And the law that he was particularly speaking about was the newly written Fugitive Slave Act that had gone into effect with the Compromise of 1850 that had allowed California to enter into the Union, among other things. He said that he did not want his tax dollars to be going towards such a immoral act, and so he stopped paying his taxes. And in case you weren't aware, if you don't pay your taxes, you get to go to jail. So he did go to jail for this act of protest. However, it would inspire many, many, many others going down the road. After this, we have Homer Plessy in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the only 3 specific Supreme Court cases that are mentioned in the course outline, at least mentioned by name. In Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy was on the train, and he was on the white car of the train, and he had purposefully gotten on the white train of the car in order to test the segregation laws. He brought it to the attention of the conductor that he was in fact 1/8 black, and this caused the conductor to then want to throw him from the train. He took this case to court. It ends up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court at the time is going to approve of this version of the 14th Amendment that he was arguing, that as long as the facilities are equal, it was perfectly okay due to the Constitution that they were separate. And so the common phrase of separate but equal is born. After this, we're going to have 2 men that have very conflicting points of view when it comes to African Americans and their role in American society post-Civil War. And that's going to be up at the top right, Booker T. Washington, and down below that is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington's point of view of African Americans was that to earn equality was going to take actual effort on the role of African Americans, that they were going to need to understand that they were going to have to take a subservient role to whites and earn their trust, earn their respect. They would be able to do this through physical labor and through jobs that were economically essential. So he wanted African Americans to get, for example, vocational jobs, vocational education, like his Tuskegee Institute, where they would be able to earn a living and become an invaluable piece of society. At that point, he believed that whites would have no other choice than to give them respect. And once they got respect, they would gain equality. Now, on the complete flip side of that, W.E.B. Du Bois, he believed, we should not ask for or wait for our equality. It is equality, it must be demanded. And so he helps formulate the NAACP, which I'll talk more about in just a little bit, to help use the legal system in order to fight for greater civil rights for African Americans. He would also go on to become a little bit of a controversial figure for other reasons, including his ties to socialism and communism. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit as well. Next, in the 1920s, one of the biggest threats to African American civil rights is going to be the rise of the KKK. although the KKK had been around since the Civil War, it had pretty much died out. Especially after Plessy versus Ferguson, there was really no threat of African Americans gaining any kind of equality up to this point. However, following World War I, we're going to see a large number of people, over 1 million card-carrying members, joining into the KKK. This new KKK, however, is going to be much broader in their number of people that they hate. So they're not just going to hate African Americans, they're also going to hate socialists and anarchists and communists. They're going to hate birth control activists and pacifists. They're going to hate bootleggers, Jews, Catholics, pretty much anybody who is not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. At the same time that's happening, though, oddly enough, African Americans were finding a way to gain a certain level of, if not equality, at least recognition for their efforts and for their contributions to society. And that was seen in the Harlem Renaissance. The music, the art, the literature, as well as just the overall sense that African American history was important, African American culture was essential to American culture, and that their struggles were both unique and also important to recognize, was a really important step in creating African American civil rights. Now, I know we're going way outside of the American purview here, but Mahatma Gandhi is actually going to be an important part of this civil rights movement, because when he was fighting for Indian civil rights against the British rule, he actually utilized and quoted the works of Henry David Thoreau pretty frequently, using his essay of On Civil Disobedience to explain why it was necessary for the Indian people to boycott the use of British goods and to stand up for their own independence. When this was successful, this now showed the rest of the world that nonviolent civil disobedience could actually work. Which brings us to the 1930s, and this is a group that we haven't talked about yet, but it's a really important step in the period of African American civil rights. And these are the young men known as the Scottsboro Boys. So these were 9 African American teenagers, anywhere from the ages of 13 to 19 years old. They had been accused of raping 2 white women on a train in 1931. Now, the thing is that these young men had actually been riding the rails as hobos, as a lot of young people were during the 1930s because of the economic crash. However, the fact that they had been pegged by not only a group of white teenage boys, but also these white women, that these young men were responsible of rape, immediately set in place for all of them except for one to almost immediately be judged as guilty. Now, the thing is that this had nothing to do with rape. In fact, the young men, the reason that they got into this whole situation in the first place is because the white teenagers had tried to kick them from the train, saying it was a white man's train. However, they ended up being overpowered by the black teenagers and got pushed from the train. When they got to the next depot, that's when the white teenagers told the local police that they had been harassed by these black teenagers. The white women got off the train and said that they had been raped. Obviously, this was simply done because they wanted to get these young men into trouble. And so all of them except for 2 ended up serving jail time. Thankfully, as time went on, they were able to have their court cases appealed. However, it was an incredibly unfair situation. There was not only not a single black person on the jury, but also just overall taking the accusal of a white person over a black person was pretty common practice at this point. And so it showed the injustice of the justice system. And finally here, we have A. Philip Randolph, and he led or was going to lead a march on Washington in the early days of in the 1940s during World War II. And the reason that he was going to have this March on Washington is because we were at war, and yet African Americans were not able to get jobs in the defense industry. They were being discriminated against. And so, with the threat of this March on Washington that would have made America look very weak in the eyes of our enemies, FDR decides to issue an Executive Order 8802, which would make it unlawful for anyone to discriminate against somebody based on their race, color, creed, or religion if they are trying to work for the government or in the defense industry. So as with our previous lessons, when you see the little YouTube symbol, that's a note to you to go ahead and click on it to get some extra material. And that'll actually link you to the music for this song, which is the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. She was an incredible a musician of the time, and she was actually really influential in helping bring to light the issue of lynching. And it was with this song. And although it doesn't ever directly mention lynching, it's very clear that that's what the subject is. Now, this song was actually inspired by a photograph. This photograph is of two young men by the name of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. And these two young men were lynched in Marion, Indiana in August of 1930. And for those of you guys who are thinking, wow, that's really far north, yeah, it really was. And that was something that a lot of Americans were really surprised by when they saw this photograph, because most people assumed that lynching was only a Southern problem, and yet it was something that was occurring across the nation, as well as that we don't really have accurate numbers as to how many people were lynched, because not only is it an illegal act, but many times the local police either allowed for the lynching to happen or sometimes were actively participating in it. This image is what inspired the song Strange Fruit. And these two young men had been lynched because they were accused of armed robbery and murder of a white factory worker and the rape of his friend. And so with the suggestion that these two teenage boys were responsible for the rape of a white woman and the murder of a white man, led to a white mob bursting into the prison and pulling these young men out and hanging them from a nearby tree. There was actually supposed to be 3 young men. However, one of them, James Cameron, narrowly avoided being lynched by the mob through the action of kind of a guardian angel in his eyes, somebody who actually spoke up and said, "This is ridiculous. You've already gotten to let the third one go." This photograph was widely spread, and it inspired the poem and later song of Strange Fruit. And it was not written by an African American who was upset by what they saw, but rather it was written by a Jewish man from New York, a man by the name of Abel Meeropol. And he saw this and he was horrified by the fact that not only this had occurred, but that this commonly occurred, as well as that there were so many white men, women, and even children watching and participating in this horrific act. And so he wanted something to be done. So when he wrote the song, he convinced a friend to give it to Billie Holiday. And she didn't want to sing it at first because it was so taboo. And when she first sang it, half of the audience got up and walked out. However, as time would go on, it would become an integral part of her repertoire and one of the songs that she is most known for. And it wouldn't have happened without this picture, and it wouldn't have brought attention to this issue without this picture. And that brings us to another lynching, and that is the lynching of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young man born in Chicago, growing up in a middle-class black neighborhood. He went down to Mississippi, and in 1955, when he was 14 years old, and the story goes that he wolf whistled at the wife of the grocery store owner, a woman by the name of Carolyn Bryant. And when news got to Bryant's husband, Roy, and his half-brother, they then kidnapped the 14-year-old Emmett Till. They beat him, shot him in the head, and then they dumped his body into the local river. It there went for an additional several days. I believe it was 4 days before his body was found. And when this happened, they then decided that his mother then decided that she wanted to ensure that justice was served. Now, the men were tried for murder. However, you can see their jury at the bottom right, and you might notice that it is an all-white, all-male jury. And as you might guess, they acquitted the two. Mamie Till, Emmett Till's mother, wanted to show the world the brutality of the South. And so she asked for an open casket funeral so that the world could see what these men had done to her baby. And the images, as you can see, are so grotesque. And when those went out around the nation and even around the world, it really laid bare how absolutely brutal this system was for African Americans down in the South and how dangerous their daily lives were. What's even more unfortunate about this is that in 2007, Carolyn Bryant, the woman in question, admitted that she had actually lied about Till wolf whistling at her. And that more than likely what had happened is that he had flirted with her, and as you know, teenage boys might say something complimentary about a prettier older woman, and she might have actually said something that was complimentary back and was potentially overheard by other people that were within the store, and she didn't want that getting back to her husband. So she made up the story of him wolf whistling at her, and as a result, it led to the death of a 14-year-old innocent boy. So we're going to cover a couple of very quick little notes about things that you probably have learned from previous classes or just from being alive. And these are some of the early battles when it came to ending segregation. So there's a few groups that you're going to need to know. The first of these we've already talked about in previous lessons, and that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. The NAACP uses the legal system and tries to change laws in order to find greater equality for African Americans. It was founded in part by our friend W.E.B. Du Bois and would be an integral part to the fight for civil rights. We're also going to have an organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, better known as CORE. They used the idea of pacifism, a nonviolent approach towards ending racial segregation. And this organization was founded by two men by the name of James Farmer and Bayard Rustin. Keep those names in mind because we will be talking about them a lot throughout the next couple of classes. The next one is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. They also adopted a nonviolent mass action strategy that they were trying to fight racial segregation, that they were pacifists, and also, like CORE, were open to all races. And this was founded in part by Martin Luther King, who we'll talk a lot more about in our future classes. And then finally, another organization that is specifically for young people, and that is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, shortened to SNCC. However, it is pronounced SNCC. SNCC was open to all races. It was a student-run organization that also, like the ones above, followed nonviolent civil disobedience resistance tactics in order to get their point across. Now, we've talked in the past about Jim Crow laws, and we know that Jim Crow laws are local and state laws that are designed to separate blacks and whites. However, these were across the country, not just in the South. And these laws kept people of color separated from whites. So this was creating separate entrances to restaurants, libraries, and theaters, having separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, and even certain places that were not open to African Americans, period, including separating and segregating them by where they lived, as well as that there were restaurants and facilities that were not open to African Americans at all. Now, some of this was done by law, which is something that we call de jure segregation. And de jure segregation sounds exactly what it, or is exactly what it sounds like. De jure meaning by judging or by law. However, a lot of this was also what we call de facto segregation. There was no official law that said it, but it was done through tradition, largely out of intimidation of the Black community. And one of the most significant places that was being segregated was schools. And although the law said that as long as the facilities were equal, it was fine that they were separate, they never were equal. Here we see in this picture two schools in the exact same city. One on the top is the white school, the one on the bottom is the colored school. And as you can see just from the outside, they are not equal. Looking on the inside, it's the same thing. The white school, very clean, very orderly, lots of stuff on the wall, individual desks, each child has their own book. And then beneath it is the colored school, where you have students of all age ranges, all being taught in the same room by a single teacher. They don't have individual desks, they're sharing books. Some of them don't even have a book. So it's clearly not equal. And that's going to lead us to our own backyard in a court case that is going to reach the California Supreme Court, and that is known as Mendez versus Westminster. So the little girl that you see on the bottom left, this is Sylvia Mendez. Now, her aunt needed to take her children, so Sylvia's cousins, down to the district office to be registered for school. Sylvia's mother and father said, please take them down to register our kids down as well. So they go ahead and they go down to the school district office, and Sylvia's cousin was much fairer skinned than she was because her father was of French background. And so her cousins, although being half Mexican, they had much fairer skin. Whereas Sylvia and her younger siblings, they were much darker skinned. And so they were denied access to the local white school, which was only a few blocks from their house. Rather, they were forced to go to the Mexican school that was far across town. And this school, as you see pictured in the background, was far inferior to anything that you would find in a white school. And so, as a result, her parents decided that they were going to take this to court. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar, Westminster is actually located in Orange County. It's like right next to Anaheim, right next to Disneyland. And so, although here we didn't necessarily have the same issues as the South between black and white, here in Southern California, it was more focused on Mexican and white. And as I said, these separate Mexican schools were definitely of an inferior quality. So when this goes to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is kind of like the California court, they ruled that the separate schools went against the 14th Amendment clause of equal protection under the law for all citizens. And as a result, said that it was unfair for her to be forced to go to the inferior school when there was a closer school that was of better quality. And so what this essentially said was that segregation in California schools was illegal. But what was really incredible is that as soon as this was passed down, our governor, a man by the name of Earl Warren, decided that segregation in general in California was unacceptable. And so he desegregated the entire state. And he said that we needed to show that all citizens would be treated equally in California. This gained a lot of public attention, as you might guess. California leading the way in this civil rights issue. However, it also gained the attention of a lawyer, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who was the lawyer for the NAACP. And they had been waiting for court cases that would help support their idea of trying to push for desegregation in American public schools. And this was the case that would inspire it. And the case that we would see is Brown versus Board of Education. So little Linda Brown, who you see in the picture here, was in a very similar situation to Sylvia Mendez. There was a white school that was only a few blocks from her house. The black school, the colored school, was several miles from her house. She had to walk 9 blocks just to get on a bus so that she could get to school as a little 5-year-old. And her parents decided that they were not going to stand for this. Now, her parents were members of the local chapter of the NAACP, and they, along with several other sets of parents, decided to sue the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. And this was going to be argued by the man you see in the picture here, which was Thurgood Marshall, the man who had been watching the case of Mendez versus Westminster. This case ends up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, said that segregation was illegal in state-funded public schools. If they are getting their money to operate from taxes that are taken by all citizens, then they must be open to all citizens. And that the idea of separate but equal is that segregation is inherently unequal. Now, it was essential that they had this law passed, or that they had this decision passed down with unanimity. And that was because if even one justice decided to dissent, it would automatically make it possible for others to then say that this was not a legitimate ruling. And so this was incredibly important, because it said that the United States had to desegregate its schools. Now, this was argued and decided in 1954. And Thurgood Marshall would then go on to a very storied career. That he would actually become the first African-American justice on the Supreme Court. And another thing that's quite interesting about the Brown versus Board of Education case is who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice for that case. And it was none other than former California Governor Earl Warren, the same man who had just a few years prior been the governor when the decision for Mendez versus Westminster was passed down. So you can definitely tell that a lot of these events are all linked together. But schools were not the only place that were segregated, and one of the most common ways was public transportation. Segregated buses were very common across the United States. Black patrons were pushed to the back of the bus, and sometimes were actually even pushed off of crowded buses altogether to make way for white patrons. And this was really remarkable, considering the fact that 75% of bus passengers were Black. So it was a law that very clearly was not doing this for any reason other than racist reasons, not for any reason other than, trying to attack one race over another. And that leads us to the very first case, really well-known case of a woman deciding to not stand up for this racism anymore. And if you're thinking it's Rosa Parks, you'd be wrong. It's actually a 15-year-old girl by the name of Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin was the first person to refuse to give up her seat on a bus. She was arrested and forcibly removed from the bus. Now, although she took a stand for something that was really very important and was really kind of almost beyond her years, she was kind of an undesirable candidate. And that was because of the way that she behaved on the bus. When the cops came to arrest her and take her off of the bus, she screamed, she kicked at them, she swung at them, she spit at them, she swore at them. And that really, that kind of undignified demeanor is what made her undesirable. The NAACP was going to try and salvage it. However, then rumors started to spread that she was actually pregnant. And to have a 15-year-old pregnant black girl who had been swearing at the cops as your spokesperson, not going to be a good start for a civil rights movement. And so instead, they looked to have somebody else who was a little bit more mature, a little bit more well-established, to go ahead and take this stand. And that would be Rosa Parks. Now, when Rosa Parks decides to stand up by sitting down, she was arrested. Now, she was calm, she was collected, she did not lash out, and she followed all of the instructions of the police as they booked her. She was fined and then released from jail, and this would become a very important moment. And in her autobiography, she says, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I wasn't tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." And so this is going to be the spark that leads to the real motivation of the civil rights movement. And that first major protest is going to be the Montgomery Bus Boycott that happens in 1955. So as we know, African Americans make up the majority of the bus riding population. And in Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks had taken her stand, they began boycotting the buses in response to her arrest, saying that they would no longer ride the buses until they were desegregated. This was led by Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they found any way possible to avoid riding the bus. They walked, they rode bikes, they carpooled, and this would even be supported by a few white activists as well, ones that wanted to support this fight against segregation. And this was not only the first major protest led under Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also it was showing how nonviolent protest could definitely achieve success. They were able to keep this up for over a year. It lasted 382 days. They walked, they rode bikes, they carpooled for over a year until the bus line finally gave in. So this is where we are going to end for today. Next class, we're going to be continuing on with the civil rights movement, and we'll go into more detail as to how young people were involved, how there was a split in the movement, and how it reached some of its most important pieces of legislation. So we'll talk all about that next time.